So now we've been talking about cross-hatching. We're coming back to that drawing that we had used as our example, and with just a little bit more work in it. So let's say you've started your sketch and the assignment is you're supposed to do about a 2-hour sketch. Well, so far this would end up being probably something like a 45-minute, maybe even an hour sketch. You can see now there's value in place. We don't have a key element, but before we get to that, I opened that gray eraser. It's called a kneaded eraser. It looked like a piece of gum wrapped in plastic, and I'm actually going to do why it's called a kneaded eraser. So it's soft and gooey. If anybody possibly remembers Play-Doh, it's like that. Where this is good is I don't like all these dark lines I got when I was out doing my original sketch. And I want to soften some of those lines. So this is an eraser or a lightning tool that lets you just roll over. So like those edges that I don't want the lines to be quite so incredibly strong, I can come in. If I want to get rid of those lines, the darkness of a particular edge, I can do that. I've got other tools as well. I've got the white vinyl eraser, and it probably started looking a little bit more like this. Here's one that's really worn. If it gets worn, what I tend to do is I just push that cardboard so that I have that other side which is really sharp. So if I want to clean this up, which is always going to be a good idea, remember you worked inside of a hand-drawn format called a thumbnail. So if you want to just remind yourself where those edges are, I could use this eraser to do that. If there's stray marks that are left from your sketch and you want to get rid of those, this is a good thing to use. If you wanted to go in and locate a highlight, let's say you wanted, like this is all just scuffed and dented and it has some paint left on it, which is why I tried showing that variation. But let's say I wanted to pull a highlight out of an edge. If I have a nice sharp edge of the eraser, I can actually just go in and draw that highlight back out. So what I want to focus on though, we talked about cross-hatching, so you've done this sketch where you've engaged cross-hatching, and that's scribbling, which is called scumbling, any kind of single direction, which is called hatch, any crisscrosses, which is called cross-hatch, and then stippling, which is synonymous with pointillism. And I realized looking at this I didn't stipple anywhere, so if I wanted, I have a really, let's pick up a lighter pencil. Here's a B, so that's fairly soft, or I mean fairly hard. So if I wanted, I could come through, because remember you can combine these techniques, so I could enhance, if I wanted, some of the areas of dark or texture by stippling. So I could work through and add stippling. But what I really want to work with right now, so you've spent an hour, hour and a half, and you've gotten all these objects. They look really good. They're describing light and shadow. There's the beginning of the sense of gradation, meaning any transition going from light to shadow or shadow to light. Here's that gradation. There's that gradation. So that's happening consistently. Well, that tells me that my light's coming predominantly from my upper right, which means not only do you have shadows on the object, and some might enhance. Like I might look at my objects that are in front of me and say, okay, this seems to be a slightly stronger core shadow in there, or this whole object barely has highlight. This edge, even though it's catching highlight, isn't quite as light as it looked when I go back and review my drawing. This dark. So you can make those object shadow decisions looking at the shapes. But if light is hitting a physical object, and that's what we're trying to create the illusion of, then the reaction to where light is blocked is a cast shadow. So I can take I have a B, really light pencil, and I'm barely putting any pressure, and I'm looking over at my still life, and I can see there's a cast shadow, and I can sort of draw where I see that cast shadow. And from that, if I'm using that just as my guide, this is elevated, so that means what I'm seeing here is a little bit confusing. The shadow is very close until it starts getting closer to that, because this overlapping piece in the front is up higher. So I'm sort of seeing something like that. This one has a big, wide cast shadow. This, because it is taller, and I'm looking and I realize I made it like that, but the reality is it's much taller than that. And this is hitting the ground, so it's narrow, it's shallow here. And then as it goes on the part that is off my screen, or I'm sorry, off my format, you see a little bit. So now I've just suggested where the cast shadow is going to be. Think about a way that you can use hatch, cross-hatching, scumbling, stippling, or invented texture in a way that this cast shadow is not physical. So the object is physical. What kind of patterns did you use to make the object feel like it has weight to it? You want to use something different. So my suggestion often is I will think about what are the directions. What's the plane, for example, it's sitting on. So this is where it might be nice. You could either do just a really simple contour, or cross contour, and just let all the lines sort of line up with the shape of your cast shadow. And as it gets closer, those lines could darken. Remember, we had earlier said there is no edge that is just physically a line. It's where one shadow meets another. So that would be one option. Another option, I could go with a hatch line and just determine I want to use for example, a single angle. So if I'm using a hatch line and I'm thinking about where that cast shadow is, I could then come closer where it's darkest and just enhance that single direction hatch line. I could go through again and really darken, and then I could come through and just add very light lines so that it has a bit of a gradation. That would be another option. So option one. Option two, you could invent a texture. You could say, I want to just do a kind of scumbling, but I want it to still stay very open. And you could come through that whole cast shadow area. So any of the techniques would work for a cast shadow. It tends to be, my recommendation is, a cast shadow is transparent. So what it is, it's where light is blocked. So I tend to think then, what is the material? What's the plane on which the cast shadow is being cast? And I try to have the pattern I'm using relate to that. So here we saw a single direction hatch. There we saw a cross contour. Here we just saw a sort of scribbly invented texture. You could go absolutely, again, in a hatch that's just following the edge of the page, and come through and put that cast shadow, and then once again come over closest to the object and then pull those lines away from that really dark edge with the same darkness as the edge itself. Those would all be options no matter what you do, and you'd work through this carefully. And then what you can do, if I did cross contour, I don't have an edge that was that sketch that I drew originally. Here I would. So I actually might come through using the pattern that I was using and try to just get rid of. Same thing up here. So I'm using my eraser making marks in the same direction that my hatch lines were down here. I might come through and just, so that it doesn't look like a coloring book where there's a dark edge and you filled in with some kind of pattern. So you have cross-hatch line technique, hatch, cross-hatch, scumbling, stippling, which is like pointillism or any invented texture. You use that on these couple objects to describe light and shadow falling on something that has mass and occupies space, so you're creating illusion of light and shadow. The transition from light to shadow is called gradation. And I guess we never wrote that, so let's write that. It's a nice dark pencil. And then we talked about a cast shadow. So all of these relate to each other. Thumbnail sketch started with a simple contour line to find the objects, get them in place. Lots of cropping so that we were thinking about positive and negative space and how well they're balanced using edge to edge. Then using crosshatch line technique to add light, the illusion of light and shadow on a three-dimensional volume. And then we talked about cast shadows. That three-dimensional volume would block light, and that is on the opposite side of the light source. So that's a really good start, and that first project you did have all of those parts in place.